Somewhere in the Mojave Desert, miles from the nearest highway, thousands of tons of steel sit perfectly still. The paint on some is barely faded. The manufacturer's plates are still bolted in place. A few still carry the livery of railroads that run trains today, this very morning, on tracks not far from here. None of these machines will ever move again. This is not a salvage yard. Nothing here is visibly broken. These locomotives were not limping toward retirement when they arrived. Many ran their last revenue miles without a single mechanical complaint, then rolled into this desert and stopped forever. Union Pacific reported over 2,000 stored locomotives at peak periods. BNSF's numbers told the same story. From Tucson to Victorville to Livermore, the graveyards stretch across the American Southwest like punctuation at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. The question that stops most people cold is not how this happened. It is why. These are not abandoned cars in a flood zone or derelict ships in a forgotten harbor. These are assets worth millions each, owned by some of the most profitable corporations in American history, sitting on private land, fully cataloged, deliberately parked. The locomotives were not broken. The economics were. What stranded them here is not a single catastrophe, but a sequence, a freight boom built on projections that collapsed, a pandemic that severed the workforce from the equipment, a philosophy of operational efficiency taken to its logical extreme, and a resale market so structurally compromised that selling these machines costs more than abandoning them. The answer lives at the intersection of tax law, industrial overcapacity, and a set of decisions made in boardrooms that made perfect sense on paper and produced this. Miles of silent steel in the desert sun. The story of the graveyards begins not with decline, but with confidence. In the early 2000s, American freight rail was expanding aggressively, and the orders flowing into GE Transportation and EMD reflected that certainty. Union Pacific, BNSF, and CSX were taking delivery of ES-44, AC, and SD-70AC E locomotives by the hundreds, each unit costing between $2 and $3 million, each one justified by traffic forecasts that looked at the time unassailable. Coal was the foundation. American utilities were burning it at record rates, and unit trains loaded with Powder River Basin coal were among the most profitable movements on the network. Railroads modeled their fleet requirements around that traffic continuing, growing even, and they ordered accordingly. The locomotives arrived on schedule. The future did not. Natural gas prices collapsed after 2012 as shale production flooded the market. Utility companies began switching fuels with a speed that caught the entire rail industry off guard. Coal carloads on some corridors fell 30 to 40% within 2 years. The trains that had justified thousands of new locomotives simply stopped running. Newer, Tier 4 compliant units were kept in service because regulations required it. Older locomotives, still mechanically sound, still capable of hauling freight, were sidelined first because the newest equipment always runs first. By mid-2016, stored locomotive counts across Class 1 railroads exceeded 4,000 units, roughly 1/4 of the entire active American fleet sitting idle, most of it in the desert, all of it depreciating. The freight recession of 2015 and 2016 erased intermodal and agricultural volumes too, closing off any remaining justification to reactivate the stored power. Railroads began slowly recalling units in 2018 and 2019 as volumes recovered. Then something far larger arrived and the graveyards filled again, deeper than before. When COVID hit in early 2020, freight volumes fell off a cliff almost overnight. Railroads did what they always do in a downturn. They cut. Thousands of engineers and conductors were furloughed within weeks. Locomotives were parked in long rows across storage yards from California to Texas. The math seemed simple enough. Less freight meant less need for crews and equipment. Reduce costs, wait for recovery, Recall workers when volumes return? The recovery came faster than anyone expected. By late 2020, consumer spending had shifted dramatically toward goods, and American freight railroads were suddenly drowning in cargo with nowhere near enough people to move it. The locomotives were there. The crews were not. Railroads had furloughed so many workers so quickly that rebuilding the workforce took months the industry simply did not have. Trains sat, freight backed up, customers screamed, precision scheduled. Railroading made everything harder. PSR was already reshaping Class 1 operations before the pandemic. Longer trains, fewer crews, tighter asset utilization. It had stripped out redundancy by design. When the system needed flexibility, there was none left to find. The pandemic did something else that mattered enormously for the graveyards. When railroads prioritized which locomotives to reactivate, they chose their newest, cleanest units first. Tier 4 compliant machines that met current EPA standards. Older Tier 2 and Tier 3 units, already stored, were quietly reclassified, not recalled, not sold. Simply moved further down the list until the list forgot about them entirely. One engineer returned from furlough to find the specific locomotive he had operated for 6 years had already been stripped for parts during his absence. The railroad had made its calculation without ceremony. Wabtec's new locomotive delivery backlog stretched 18 to 24 months. The industry had a shortage and a surplus at the same time. The desert was not chosen by accident. When railroad fleet managers began moving surplus locomotives into long-term storage, the geography of where they ended up reflected decisions as deliberate as any balance sheet entry. Tucson, Victorville, Livermore. These locations were selected because dry desert air is the closest thing a locomotive has to a preservation chamber. Corrosion moves slowly in the Mojave. Electrical systems degrade at a fraction of the rate they would in Louisiana humidity or Ohio winters. A locomotive parked in Arizona in 2016 looks a decade later remarkably similar to the day it arrived. Railroads own or control vast stretches of land along their rights-of-way, much of it in exactly these climates. Storage yards sit on existing main lines, which means a unit could theoretically be recalled and reactivated without repositioning costs. The infrastructure for retrieval exists. The decision to use it does not. The classification system that governs stored locomotives reveals how deliberate the process is. Ready reserve units are maintained at a level that allows reactivation within 30 to 90 days. Dead storage units receive minimal attention and are effectively written off operationally, though they remain on the books until a formal retirement entry closes the ledger. The transition from ready reserve to dead storage happens quietly, often without announcement, and almost never reverses. What the geography also provides is distance from regulators, from public view, and from certain reporting obligations that attach differently to commercial storage facilities versus railroad-owned private property. Storing locomotives on private right-of-way land limits exposure under several EPA frameworks that would otherwise require more active environmental monitoring and disclosure. The graveyard looks like neglect from the highway. From inside the accounting department, it looks like a managed system operating exactly as intended. What happens next to those locomotives is even more deliberate than where they were sent. The assumption most people make is that a railroad sitting on thousands of idle locomotives would have no trouble finding buyers. The reality dismantles that assumption methodically, one obstacle at a time. EPA Tier 4. Certification is the first wall. Any locomotive intended for re-entry into American service must meet current emission standards regardless of when it was built. Testing alone routinely exceeds $120,000 per unit, covering only the paperwork and engineering analysis. Retrofitting older engines with selective catalytic reduction systems and diesel particulate filters adds hundreds of thousands more. Then the EPA may still reject the application. For a locomotive that might fetch $200,000 at auction, the certification math produces a guaranteed loss before a single bid is placed. The software problem is quieter, but equally fatal. Wabtec and Progress Rail control the proprietary diagnostic systems that govern modern locomotive operations. A retired unit cannot be legally certified for revenue service without manufacturer cooperation on the software systems, and that cooperation is rarely extended to locomotives the manufacturer considers end of life. Auction listings increasingly carry warnings that read like obituaries: electronics unsupported, control modules unserviceable, sold as is with no operational guarantee. A late model AC4400CW recently failed to attract a single viable bid after prospective buyers discovered the control software was permanently locked. Export markets look promising until due diligence begins. Developing nations that could theoretically absorb older American locomotives rarely have the parts infrastructure to support high-horsepower AC traction units long-term. Deals collapse during technical review when buyers realize they are purchasing not just a machine, but a dependency on a supply chain that will not follow it across the ocean. CERCLA liability follows every sale like a shadow. The short line market has consolidated. The buyers who remain are sophisticated enough to walk away. The graveyard keeps filling because the exit door is effectively sealed. When every option has been exhausted, what remains is arithmetic. Fleet managers running the final calculation on a retired locomotive are not making a philosophical choice. They are reading a ledger that has already made the choice for them. Cannibalizing a stored unit for parts returns over $210,000 in recoverable value. Prime movers, traction motors, control systems stripped and cataloged back into the active fleet. Abandonment generates a tax shield through ordinary loss deductions on the remaining adjusted basis, often delivering between $100,000 and $150,000 in protected income under Macker's depreciation rules. Preparing a locomotive for sale, by contrast, costs upwards of $300,000 in certification, legal review, and environmental compliance before a single buyer makes an offer. And that offer in a saturated market will likely come in below $140,000. The net loss on a sale can exceed $200,000 per unit. The ledger is not ambiguous. Environmental remediation adds another layer the balance sheet carries silently. Full EPA-compliant decommissioning of a single locomotive, PCB removal, fluid disposal, asbestos abatement, heavy metal handling, reaches $180,000 when every line item is counted. Railroads absorb this liability by delaying formal decommissioning indefinitely, letting the desert do the slow work of attrition while the accounting entry remains open. What no American railroad has seriously pursued is the model that European operators use: structured leasing agreements that transfer retired locomotives to Eastern European and African rail networks, with parts supply guarantees attached. It is a system that turns stranded assets into long-term revenue. It requires coordination, liability negotiation, and institutional patience that four dominant Class I railroads competing on efficiency ratios have little incentive to develop. The consolidation of American freight rail into four companies removed the competitive pressure that might otherwise force creative solutions. When every major player faces the same economics, the same tax treatment, and the same regulatory exposure, they all arrive at the same answer. The graveyard is not a failure of imagination. It is the unanimous conclusion of an industry that optimized itself into a corner. The locomotives in the Mojave did not end up there because nobody wanted them. They ended up there because, on paper, that was exactly where they were supposed to be. If you ran a railroad, would you do anything differently?